What is up, 20+? We are back for another episode of the 20+ podcast. I'm here, Pastor Logan, here with Brett, like last time, and this is Sydney, special guest with us. She's one of our great friends, and she serves here on the 20+ team, and we're excited to have you because today we're talking about a fun topic, which is singleness, finding the one, topics that I know a lot of us care a lot about, and I'm really excited. And I know we've been in this relationship series, and we just are wrapping up our life groups, about to have Culture Convos. How have you guys enjoyed our relationship series? What are maybe some things you guys got out of it or you saw in your groups?
Yeah, I feel like for me, you and I had the conversation a while back just about boundaries. And when you brought that to light in my own life, it was super insightful because I had never, growing up in the church, I was always told, don't be doing these physical things.
Right.
Which, that's great information. But I think to leave out watch how you handle these emotional things. Watch how you handle these spiritual things too. Really, really insightful for me. And I think that was the kind of the vibe I got from the people in our groups was, whoa, that's a fresh take. And that's not only a fresh take, but a very helpful take. So I love that. I mean, I love just that we're bringing something that's maybe not totally new information, but it's really applicable and really practical. So I love that week for sure.
Yeah, having, with boundaries, having a different perspective from someone that's close to our age. We're a young adult community. Having someone that's, recently gone through it teach us, I think, is just incredibly valuable.
Speaking of recently gone through it, Sydney just got engaged.
I sure did, yay!
So let's go. Nice segue there, just kind of throwing it up. When people get engaged, all of a sudden their left hand just becomes way more noticeable.
Yeah, it's weird.
It's like they
weird.
They brush their hair with it. They're drinking with their left hand. They're right-handed, but they just are writing with their left hand.
All of a sudden.
Actually, that's funny. One of my good friends got engaged last week, and she sent me a photo of her drinking just a regular bottle of water. And she said, "This is awesome water." And I looked at the text 3 times, and I was like, this water is so irrelevant to me. I was at work so confused, just like,
what is going on?
Why do I care?
Yeah.
And I put my phone in my pocket, and I literally worked for 10 minutes, and finally in my head I was like, it's not the water. I was like, oh!
That is a teaching in its own right. It's not about the water.
Yeah. And no one is exempt from that. If you just got engaged and you're telling me you're not all of a sudden showing your ring off, you're lying to me.
Yeah, or maybe you didn't pick the right person.
Yeah, that's true. You're a little let me be honest. Do you like it?
My dad has a teaching. For those who don't know, my dad's a pastor here at our church, and he has a teaching. It's called "Don't Turn the Ring," because one time my mom was with some of her old friends when they were engaged, and she turned the ring around so the diamond wasn't showing because she didn't want to get asked about her engagement. And my dad is like, "Are you kidding me?" And so he says, "Don't turn the ring. Don't be ashamed to be married to be." In the same way, don't be ashamed to be a follower of Christ. So, man, we're already going there.
Wow.
And if maybe you're listening to this, maybe it's the day of it coming out, or a few days after, we have Culture Convos. Yeah. And so we're going to be wrapping up with conversations around 3 different locations, our regions, and so that'll be at East Side, West Side, and City. We have all the details up on the Instagram and Facebook channels as well. So make sure to check that out. Channels, pages, you just say the words, but so make sure to be at that. Or if you're watching this later, you can go back and watch Culture Convos or listen to them as well. But obviously today is on relationships, singleness, finding the one. Where do we start? Where do we start from here?
Wow, where do we start? There's so many places I think we can go. For me, I think it's cool. In this room, we just have so many different perspectives on where we're at in the whole dating, or single dating, engaged, married. And for me, I'm dating now. And that's been a fun journey. It's the only part of this whole process that the Bible doesn't really talk about.
Sure.
But I think that doesn't mean that there's not something in the Bible for us to kind of bring from this, what do we learn from how the Bible talks about our character? What do we learn from... The Bible does talk about singleness a lot, and frankly, I've found myself a little bit confused sometimes by Paul's words. It's better not to marry, and I'm like, well, I want to get married. I want to do that, and then you see in the Garden of Eden where God says it's bad for man to be alone. So how do we reconcile these things? I think just to start it off, singleness. Let's get at that one first. Really simple thought, but Jesus was single.
Totally. I think that is probably the most important thing to start with, because Jesus was single, and if we're wanting to be like Jesus,
right.
we see that Jesus was single, and so it makes you kind of scratch your head a little bit, because you're like, wait a minute, if the person that I'm trying to be more like was not married and never dated, never dating wasn't really a thing in that time, but didn't have a romantic relationship. So should I be more like that? And then all of a sudden Paul starts writing, and then you see different things like in Jeremiah, where in Jeremiah 16 he says, Jeremiah, you should be unmarried and have no kids, because you should be faithful to me in the way that you serve me and the calling that I have for you. But he also says to Jeremiah, don't go to funerals, don't go to weddings, don't go to feasts. So I think what he was talking about in Jeremiah's case was a very specific calling to say, this is what I want you to do because of the season that the world around you is in.
Yeah.
And I think for Jesus, it would be very challenging for the Son of God to have a dating or marriage relationship. So that kind of like putting Jesus aside, knowing that we don't necessarily have to be crucified for the sins of the rest of the world, we maybe have a different perspective on it. So then that leads me to Paul, and I'm getting somewhere here, but this is probably the most popular topic when it comes to singleness, is, Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:1, he says, if you're a man, it's better that you would not marry. And I mean, that's pretty clear. It sounds pretty clear.
Right.
Okay, so it's better to not marry. And you're reading this and you're like, I know that when I read this, I was in, senior in high school, and I'm like, have I just been living like this my whole life, been like a lie, everything? Like, my parents are married and they love Jesus. Like, what am I doing? You read this, and then you kind of have that moment. And I think everyone probably has that moment where you are trying to accept that fact for about 6 minutes.
Right.
You're like, okay, I mean, God, if that's
what it says.
Yeah.
And I guess here we go.
Follow the word. I want to be that way. And I think it's important to understand the context that Paul's writing in it. So he's writing this in the book of Corinthians. And the Corinthian church was in the midst of Corinth, which was a town, but Romans were like some of the most pagan people. I mean, they were literally like the view that they had on their sexuality was so wrong and skewed. I mean, there was just crazy stuff. I don't even want to get into all of it, but it's like they would, like, you talk about pornography now, like back then they would have like terrible, I mean, they talk about orgies in the Bible, all these things. Again, I'm not getting into it in the podcast, but it's like things that you would say nowadays that like you would never even do that are even legal, but there was just kind of commonplace. So he's saying, how hard is it in Corinth to be somebody who has a sexuality that is honoring to God? There's temptations everywhere. So be careful in that. So I think it's better for you to try and avoid those temptations and just remain that way. And then the second part of that is Paul thought, and as a lot of the disciples did, they thought that Jesus was coming back like any day.
Yeah.
When Jesus says, I'm going to come back like a thief in the night, I'm going to, be ready. He tells the parable of the virgins and the lanterns, and you got to be ready to go. Paul's thinking, Jesus could come back any day. We got to be ready for this. And so with that, there's this expectation where Paul's saying, it's better for you, if you're already married, that's fine, stay married, but don't jump into marriage because Jesus is coming back. We got to go and tell people. And he has this anticipation and this, energy focused on Jesus could return at any moment. Yeah. So with that, don't jump into a life in a marriage that you have to spend the rest of your life focusing on. You may only have a couple hours left. You may only have a few years left. And so those are two things that are really important. And then we actually see later in Ephesians, which is written after Corinthians, that Paul writes one of the most famous lines on marriage, which is the idea of love and respect. He writes this to, wives to respect their husbands and husbands to, love their wives. And so if he saw that and he sees that as this is the great example that Jesus is going to come back from the church, all these big theological ideas come from that. And so later on, I think Paul, as the years go on, as he realizes maybe Jesus isn't coming back today, or he could, but he's not sure, he starts to see, hey, even though marriage isn't right for me because of the call that God has, there is a powerful place of the way that it shows the world of what a covenant relationship looks like. So that's your crash course on singleness and what the Bible teaches about it. There's obviously more in there, but I think those are the main ones that people focus on that say, is it a sin to be single? And, it's not a sin to be single, but then there's the other side, is it a sin to be married? No. It's not. God says if you have a call that leads you somewhere that maybe you can't go, similar to the way that we talked about Christ, but maybe you feel like you have a call to be a missionary and go into a really dangerous part of the world, and you're not married.
Right.
At that point, it'd be very difficult to say to somebody, I want to say yes to be marrying you, but you have to say yes to this call that God has on my life. And I think that's a difficult thing to do.
Right. You look at what Paul is saying, and elsewhere Paul says, hey, it's actually better to get married than to burn with sexual desire. Right. And so what is his priority? When we look at, he says, hey, it's better not to marry, but then he also says it's better to get married than to burn. So there's kind of this relationship for him, and what's at the top of his priority list is righteousness. Mm-hmm. If you can be more righteous in marriage, because we believe that sex only happens in the confines of marriage, then do that thing. Don't try to kill yourself saying no to what God really placed in you. Mm-hmm. And I think when it comes to singleness, sometimes we demonize the very thing that God placed within us. He said, hey, this is a young adult podcast, but sex is a gift that is used. I mean, the first command he gives to Adam and Eve, go and populate the earth, essentially.
Right.
Which, hey, I mean, you got to do that one way. There's only one option to populate the earth. So, but it's a gift, but how do we have a healthy mentality towards it in singleness? Totally. And then how do we not just leave a healthy mentality in singleness, how do we always have a healthy mentality about sex and sexuality and honoring someone through that? And so what's the goal of his commands? What's the goal of his teaching? Righteousness. Totally. Let's live it in a manner that's honoring to God. And to get that insight also that, hey, Paul wasn't just really talking to we kind of look at our culture and we say, dang, this is kind of wild that we're a sexualized culture. We're kind of doing it okay compared to some of the things that went on in the Bible.
Yeah. We're nothing compared.
And so when you see that, it's like, did we even want to mess with that fire in Paul's day? Mm-hmm. Did you even want to step one step closer through marriage to, I'm going to let myself walk into that life? But yeah, I mean, talk about what's the goal? Righteousness.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
yeah, and I think that when you're in a dating relationship, all you're thinking about is the next step, in a lot of different things. I think one of the things that we most appreciated about when we got married, one of our boundaries that we talked about in our life groups was we didn't want to ever be alone. Mm-hmm. And so it was the most freeing thing that once we got married, it was like, we're alone. We're just chilling, watching a movie at 9:00 in the morning on a Saturday or whatever, and it's like you can just be alone, and that's one of the gifts. But when you're dating and you're engaged, and a proof of that is Sydney posted on Instagram the other day. She's like, engagement's overrated. This sucks. I want to get married.
Yes.
So Sydney's ready to go. But I think there's a lot of things that come with that we just want to be together. We just want to have those things, but it's don't do it in the wrong time.
Right.
Don't do it to where you can't control yourself. And when Paul says, when you're burning with passion for someone, when you love someone, it's like, not just sexual passion, but just you want to be alone, you want to spend time, you want to build a family, do all these different things. And Paul's saying, don't smack yourself. And I think there's a lot of people who have that holier than thou attitude of well, because I'm single. Well, no, you're not single because you're choosing to be. You're super insecure about it. Wow. But then there's other people who are single and they don't talk about it, and they're proud with what God's doing in their life. And so I think it's more about what God's doing on the inside than what's on the outside. And then there's people in marriage that are super frustrated that they got married because it was the wrong decision. They rushed it. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you see them pretending to be happy or all this stuff, and it's because they wanted the few things that come with marriage that were, I can't control myself, but they did it with the person that wasn't the right person.
You see from the outside how it looks, but then once you get in it, and if you weren't ready, it's terrifying. It could be terrifying.
Totally.
And what a silly mentality to say, hey, look, I'm just gonna get married because that'll fix my problems. Right. And it's like, oh man, that is just, I think for me, I've seen a lot of situations where a relationship has been a band-aid to a problem that needs surgery. Totally. And it's like, hey, how do we use the singleness productively, and how do we, we'll touch on this later, but how do we say, hey, the season I'm in is the most important season for me right now. because it sets up the next one.
Totally.
Right? I love what John Bevere said when he came. What did he say? He said, you can always delay. You can never speed up your wilderness time, but you can certainly delay it, right? So if you're in a desert, if you're in a valley, you can certainly slow that process down by making decisions contrary to the will of God in your life, but you can't really speed it up.
Right.
So you might as well use it. You might as well be in it and say, I'm going to learn how to forgive people. You know, I'm going to learn how to communicate well.
Right.
You know, I'm going to learn how to manage my emotions, manage my anger. That's one thing, I guess, just to talk personally. Yeah. I've spent a lot of time understanding what gentleness really looks like. I grew up in a home where my dad was a master of it. Like, I don't know if I've ever seen my dad make an emotional decision where he's been outraged and like made a decision. I find myself like, if McDonald's is out of ice cream, I'm yelling at somebody, and it's like, dude, you don't understand like how to do this. Yeah. And so when you get into a situation with somebody you really care about, and you know, we talked one day about what's a really kind of telling situation. If you travel with somebody, it really reveals a lot of like, holy cow, like you just did like a very little thing, and I yelled at you because I'm kind of tired, and we've been traveling together. And so to become really, to honestly, for me to pray into, God, give me a gentle heart. Yeah. I'm a kind of an intense guy. I get really excited, and sometimes that comes off as sharp. Like I'll say something and I'll be like, wow, okay, I gotta apologize because that wasn't okay. And so,
Cindy, have you ever traveled with Noah?
We've traveled a few times. We've done a few road trips, and we've
stayed in separate hotels. Yeah,
road trip, like 1 day road trips. Got it. I'm just making sure. There was one time we were driving home. We were driving home from Thanksgiving, and it was snowing so bad, and we were both like, "What do we do? We can't get a hotel." Like, and both of us neither had like booked one, you know, by ourselves. We're like, "What do we do? We don't know how to do it."
Booked a hotel before.
We're young though, like, and driving. We're like, "Do we keep going? Do we just drive?" We ended up going all the way, you know. But that was fun. That we talked before then, like, this is gonna be telling. Like, what do we talk about for 12 hours in the car? What do we do? Oh yeah. And then you get to the end and you're like, oh yeah, that was nice. you know? Or complete opposite. You're angry, but thankfully for us it was.
You want to have, and this is another thing about singleness and dating. I think Seth and I, my brother who's married, was telling me, like, I think some people approach dating and say, well, I don't want to be with them too much. And I think there is an unhealthy level of reliance on somebody, and there can be that. But I think when you're getting to the real nitty gritty of it, you kind of need to spend a good amount of time together. Right. Otherwise, how else do you know? All of a sudden, you went from dating and you spent 2 days a week together, and you say, we're going to get married. You live together. Right. And you don't even really know how you interact when somebody has a bad day. You don't really know how you interact when someone faces a serious disappointment. So sometimes I think dating, we walk on this, I got to keep them at a distance, which I do think boundaries are really healthy. Yeah. But I think there's also something to be said for, let's get ourselves in scenarios that teach us about each other in a healthy way. And we can learn about someone else's character, but also their response to disappointment, their response to being tired. Right. Honestly, this is a big one. Their response to being hungry. I know people get hungry and like they're freaking out at everyone they see. You know?
I want to meet somebody who doesn't. Like honestly, like, hey, wow, you've been fasting and you're good. Like, maybe people in the military, but when I'm like hungry, usually I miss lunch though. I like, Matt gets so mad at me because I miss lunch all the time, just because I'm working and I just get in the flow. And like, you know, my brother, he's like, how do you forget lunch? It's the best. You know? But I just forget. And then by the time 3 o'clock rolls around, I'm like, wow, dinner's gonna be in a few hours, so like why as well wait? And then I'm just angry when I get home. Yeah. And it's like, and then the worst part is we don't know what we're gonna eat. And then she gets home from work, and it's like we just set ourselves up for failure. But yeah, it's whoever is not hangry, you're one to be a friend with. Right. You want to spend time. And maybe they can cook. Maybe they can cook for me.
Back to singleness though, and like learning yourself, how you yourself respond when you're hangry, or when you are tired, and learning like, okay, if I'm very tired, I know that I'm gonna be angry. How do you deal with it? You know, something that I like spent a lot of time on was, all right, I know that I'm not a very nice person when I'm tired, so I better either margin time for me. Listen up. I better margin time for me to be by myself when I'm tired, or I have to like. For me, there was a verse that I read all the time, like, you better be joyful. You know, like you have to sit in the car until I'm like, all right, you know, like learn that about yourself when you're single.
Yeah, and on that line, I think even for me, and I think Logan and I, we talked about this the other day.
I guess we talk a lot.
We do talk a lot. After working kind of a longer day, I think sometimes you can get done with maybe a long day at work, or maybe you worked really hard studying or whatever it was, and all of a sudden you find yourself, I don't want to say looking for a pat on the back, but you get a little bit entitled.
Yeah.
And so you come into a moment where you're supposed to be serving the person that you really care about, and you can't even see their needs because you just think, I work so hard.
Right.
And it's all of a sudden, now you've turned all of, like, everything in your mind is focused on you. And so for me, you get tired. For me, if I work a long day and it's like, by the end of the day, I'm just like, okay, that was a good day of work, but like, someone needs to tell me I did a good job, which that's not really true. But sometimes that's my mentality. I get a little bit entitled. I miss a moment to say, hey, what do you need? It's always, well, what do I need? And so to gain that self-awareness, super key.
Yeah,
so.
and I think, that really leads us into, like, when we talk about finding the one, there's a lot of thoughts like, is there one person? Is there this? I think it really starts with becoming the one.
Right.
Becoming the person that God has called us to be, because, I think sometimes in a relationship, like, I've talked to people, every relationship, just the girlfriend I'm with or the boyfriend I'm with, we just always argue. Well, maybe
there's a common denominator here.
The common denominator is you,
right.
Or man, we don't have a lot of fun, or we don't do this, and it's like, maybe you're not very fun, or maybe you're not, and it's
right.
like, it's an interesting thought, but it's, the idea of why point a speck out in somebody else's eye when you have a log in your own, and it's, how can I become the person that I know is going to be somebody who can be in a great relationship? Right. Not that we're ever perfect. We can't ever be perfect, and we that's not the checklist before we get married. But it's, how can I become that person to say, hey, I'm maybe trying to be the best person I can be.
Right.
Because once you get married, it's like, we believe that, you're married, you're it, so you can't really change that person. And so hopefully you're finding somebody who's that as well. But what maybe some of your guys' thoughts? I mean, obviously, Mac and I have been married. It'll be 3 years this year. But Sydney, maybe like, you and Noah, you're engaged, you're getting married soon. As you are, what are some of the things you're learning in this process of, wow, maybe in a wedding, I'm a little selfish on some things. I realize that a lot about me.
Yeah.
The first week of marriage, you're like, wow, I'm really selfish.
Yeah.
But maybe in that engagement process, there's some things you've seen in that?
The biggest thing for me has been, like, I've been subconsciously trying to hold on to my individuality. And even though in my mind I'm like, no, I don't want it to be like that. Things that I'm like, for example, food. Like, that's an easy one. That's like, I want to have Indian food, but I know Noah's not going to want to have Indian food. Why do I care? But all of a sudden, that's like,
Indian food is great, though.
I love Indian food,
I'm on your side.
But that coming up is like, that would never have come up before. But all of a sudden, because I know in my spirit, it's preparing for that. It's preparing for to become one. But then the flesh part of me is like, no, we're going to hold on to our individuality, and you're going to eat that Indian food. It's like, why don't you have Indian food for lunch tomorrow? Because you're not married and you can take it. You know what I'm saying? So it's like subconsciously trying to hold on to my individuality, even though I don't actually want to. It's so interesting and honestly kind of frustrating.
Yeah.
But like trying to pray and figure out, like, is this a bigger deal than just my flesh fighting against what's coming? It's interesting and it's fun, honestly, like knowing that it's coming, but
totally. I think that's that idea, though, that natural kind of in us, the individuality in us, is something that I think is one of the reasons why there's so many failed relationships in our culture today. Obviously, when we look at Scripture, it's God says the two become one flesh. They're no longer separate, but they're together. They become one. Their passions, their callings, their family, their even for many people, their names. It's you become one person. It's a new person that's not 50%, 50%. It's 100%, 100%. It becomes this new thing. And I think so many people in relationships, and oftentimes this is why dating relationships fail, but even unfortunately we see people that end up walking away from their marriages is because it's the individuality portion of that. It's, well, I'm coming into this agreement with my spouse that we're going to do this. And it's, you're not coming into an agreement, you are coming into a covenant.
Right.
And you're saying, no, we're becoming one, we're becoming new till death do us part, not because of what we say, but because of what God says.
Right.
And so I think that idea of this is what I want, that's the nature you fight in marriage for, you know,
Ever.
the whole, forever. And that's, you know, we talk about it, but it's like happy wife, happy life. It's, you know, or just agree and don't start problems. Just like, it's not worth it.
Right.
But I think that idea comes from, it's not about us. And that's the reason why God loves marriage, is because he wants us to show the world what a covenant relationship is like. It's the only other covenant relationship that we have on earth besides the covenant relationship that we have with Jesus. So if we're going to have a relationship that is showing the world what God's love is like in the closest way, not always perfect, then we can't be our own people that are doing our own things. You have so many people that you hear, well, yeah, we have separate bank accounts, even like separate rooms in the house. Like, I mean, for years and years, marriage in like Europe was, they would have separate beds. They'd sleep in different rooms. And you're like, they were just roommates who had, you know, they had public figure with the king and the queen or whatever, but they weren't really having that covenant relationship.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is a hard thing to fight, especially as you start, but every day it's a battle to say, you know what, am I being selfish?
Right.
Or am I being the kind of person that God wants me to be, which is selfless?
Right.
I think, I mean, to touch on what you said, marriage and any relationship, but when it becomes marriage, it just becomes so much closer.
Right.
It's really a sanctifying experience. And ultimately, I think that's why, part of the reason I think God talks about Adam and Eve in the garden and says, hey, it's not good for a man to be alone. I think that's maybe a little different than this whole sanctifying process we're talking about. But I think maybe some component of why God thought, hey, marriage is a good idea, that two becoming one is a good idea, is because it just kind of shoves out some of that, okay, a little bit of selfishness just got kicked out. Oh, you want to have kids? Okay.
Right.
A lot more selfishness gets kicked out of your soul just because of the nature.
Right.
This kid's dependent on me. My wife and I, we have to make decisions together, and we have to come to agreement, compromise. I mean, I'm not saying, again, marriage isn't for everybody, but I think there is something, when you lean into it, marriage really leans back on you, and I think it really is a sharpening.
Totally.
You know, when you put the work in, when you say, hey, we're going to decide, like you said, this is a covenant, we decided that. So now we don't make our relationship work around what we want. We make what we, you know, not how we feel. We decided this.
Right.
Let's live it out. Let's create it. And that's a lot of faith, really, is, look, I'm in convictions, they're not really so that you can be in a moment of temptation and say, this is my conviction. No, it's for beforehand that, hey, look, I decided I don't do that thing anymore, so I'm not even going to face that temptation. You know, look, we didn't even give ourselves a doorway out of this relationship. So divorce has never been a conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. So
Yeah, I think one of the hardest parts that I found early on in marriage was that you have to accept the idea that you can't make the decision on behalf of
Right.
you know, your spouse, because they're not you. And I think sometimes we think this, but when we say God made us one flesh, well, all right, I'm the spokesperson.
Totally.
Like we are one, but today I'm the spokesperson of our relationship, and the spokesperson would say that this is what we're going to do.
Right.
So we're going to eat Indian food, you know. But I know early on, and I hope my mom listens to this, but my mom and Mac were disagreeing about like where we were going to eat. I think it was something like just insignificant about that. But for a long portion of my life, you know, I'm whatever my mom says, I want to honor her. I read honor my father and mother, honor what she's doing. And the first time that I had to disagree with my mom in order to align with Mac was like this super weird thing. And I know Mac and I had like this conversation about it. She's like, why is this so hard for you? And again, it wasn't something like super significant, but it was just like she wanted to do that and Mac wanted to do this or go somewhere or stay home or whatever it was. And I remember how much like I finally realized, wow, like when it says a man should leave his father and mother and go. I'm like, this makes total sense now.
Right.
But it took a lot to do that, and there'll be times where all of a sudden you're going, wow, my siblings say this, but my husband says this.
Right.
And whether it's a different view on like something that happens in the world, or different view on health, like vaccination, just weird. There's all these things that you don't realize you have to care about when you become an adult, but it's like, wow, I guess I just did that because that's what my family did. But their family was totally different. This is how they spend holidays. This is how we spend holidays. And you just have to work so much harder to do that. And so I think that's where Paul's talking about, hey, it's easier to be single. He's saying there's a lot of things that come with this that you just aren't prepared for.
But when we talk about finding the one, and like this part of like your flesh is gonna like eat you alive, you're gonna want to like just go the opposite way and everything, but when you find the one, it makes you want to do it. I think that's like half the excitement, is you want to then agree with them, even though it's like the awkward, like, oh, I'm disagreeing with my dad, that he's my dad, but it's like, no, as my fiance, I'm gonna agree with him.
Totally.
We're getting married, but I want to do that more than anything,
It's
and
like
that's the fun, like really fulfilling, like heart.
Oh yeah.
Huge, like,
the
it's
butterflies
the best.
and the excitement.
Yeah.
I pictured like movies where like the girl comes home with this like suit, like the guy with all the like tattoos and the, like, black hair and choker and like looks bad, and it's like, I want to go with what he's doing. He's telling me to go to this party, and the dad's like, no. That was just what I pictured when Sydney was saying that. Like, my dad. I don't know why I pictured that, but Noah's a great guy.
He is a great guy.
Noah. He's gonna listen to this. So good.
Winner.
Another thing that we talk about a lot with finding the one is you got to find somebody that loves Jesus.
Right.
And you can't just be a good person and find a good person. There's a lot of good people in the world.
Right.
But one thing that the Bible's very clear on is if you do marry, you got to find someone that has that same passion.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe, I don't know if you've seen that in your friends. I don't know if you guys have dated somebody in your life that didn't love Jesus, but like, what are some of the things you guys have seen in that to where, okay, God's pretty clear on that, but you see people compromise on it a lot.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's really easy to make that statement and say, well, you don't date someone who's not saved. One of the phrases I like is you don't date to save.
Right.
I mean, whether you call it missionary dating,
dating,
whatever it is. For me,
classic.
it's, hey, you don't date to save. I tell my little sisters this all the time, and they're probably annoyed by now, but it's true. I think for me, it's easy for me to say that. But then when I get into a moment where I find myself attracted to a female and she's fun to be around and whatever, and then I find out, they're not really a follower of Jesus, I still somehow want to like bend my belief to make it work. And like, I hate to admit that, but the reality is, I think that's how it is for a lot of us, where we would say, I would never date someone who's not saved. But then when you actually step into a moment where you're talking to a pretty girl and it's really fun and you're like, dang, like, do I need to date someone saved? And again, I almost those words feel like,
how saved is saved?
And that's exactly it. I think even one of the things I've noticed is, I don't mean to say that you need to both be on the same like level of passion for the Lord, but I think you kind of need to be close, because I've seen people who I know, somebody's been just lit up for Jesus, like they just reading the Bible every day, serving at church a lot. And again, not that these aren't badges we wear on our sleeve, but it's just a level of passion. It's a level of relationship, and then their partner or their girlfriend or boyfriend is kind of maybe just dipping their toes in the water, so to speak, and it gets awkward fast because values change quickly, and again, you brush into each other in a way that's like, hey, you know what, you are saved, but I'm not sure we're really sprinting the same pace. And all of a sudden I just outran you by 500 meters, and now I gotta, sorry, I'm thinking track. Jen runs track, so we talk meters.
Go to the metric system.
I'm sorry. I just outran you by a mile, or whatever it is, where I think you need to do everything you can to come into a situation where, hey, do you read your Bible every day? And I know that's a kind of awkward first date question, but it's pretty good first date question, where it's like, hey, how much do you love the Bible? I've read it like once in the last month.
John 3:16.
Yeah, like for me, it was like I wanted to find somebody who said, the Bible's what I'm built on.
Right.
And the Bible's my language.
Right.
I've written it on my heart. It's my DNA. And because there are levels of, everyone, I'm saved. But like you say, how saved is maybe the wrong way to say it. But how passionate, how persistent are you in your pursuit?
Right.
So,
yeah, Sidney, obviously when you met Noah, you can tell a little bit about that story, but what made you know that you guys were both kind of going the same direction? I mean, I think it can be easy. You meet somebody who goes to church, or they kind of check the boxes.
Right.
But ultimately, the only people who truly know us is ourselves and God.
Right.
But it's our job to maybe assess as best as we can how their walk with God is. What were some of the things that you kind of saw in each other that you knew he was legit?
Yeah. So I'm going to take it a little back. Before I even met Noah, something that, I had a list of, kind of prerequisites, everyone kind of has their list. But you got to get past
list?
Oh, it was written down.
Did you have an
totally.
application to fill out too?
Yeah, I'm sure. But, it wasn't, just a high school list. It has to be tall and blonde and athletic. You know what I mean? It wasn't, but it was,
These were prayerful.
These were prayerful.
You didn't have that. Okay.
No, these were prayerful, these are things that, and you get
Yeah.
specific with it, but through prayer, okay,
Yeah.
God, I don't want it to be me, but what do I need? And that was a big prayer for me. Let him be what I need to get closer to you,
That's
you know?
great.
And so many times, early conversation, he'll tell you this, it took him a lot of convincing for me to like him, fall in love, this whole
Why?
deal. I don't think it took a lot of convincing, but when he explains it, I'm like, oh yeah, it took a lot of convincing.
You played a little hard to get.
I played a little hard to get, but our first 3 months was long distance, so you don't know each other over the phone like you do in person, but that's whole other. But through conversations about reading the Bible, about growing up, about our relationship with Christ, he would ask questions that were made me think about things that was oh man, that's interesting, and that makes me think about God in a completely different angle. And I think about it here's God, and I see him from this way, but I want to see the whole thing. I want to learn the whole thing. So Noah would take my angle and shift it just a little bit. And I think that was, to me, how I knew, that was, we are on the same page here, and he's going to challenge me, and he's going to make me think about things that I didn't even know I needed to think about. And he's not doing it on purpose, but it's his personality and his walk and my walk that's just going to come together, and going to challenge and sharpen each other. And so
I think it's important to note too, with that, obviously one of your prerequisites was that he follows the Lord. Right. But let that not be your only thing. Right. And I think that's maybe a weird thing to hear a Christian say, but it's really true. I walked through a relationship where, the person I was dating, they were really passionate about Jesus, but just personality-wise and sort of some of the dynamics, it just didn't really work. Right. And I think that's okay. If someone you want to date and they're pretty, they're fun to be around, and they love the Lord, those aren't the only things. There are other little things that you have to think about. Right. And again, when it comes to becoming the right person, part of that process is the self-awareness to evaluate, what do I value, right? Is my significant other this? Okay, but for me, one of the things, does my family like my significant other? That's a big part of it, and that's not everything, right? If I get married, my parents aren't married to my wife. I'm married to my wife, so it's ultimately my decision. But it is a value of mine that when we get together with family, it's a blast. Right. She fits in. My parents like her. It's natural. And I think that's where sometimes, like you said, yeah, of course, you want him to follow the Lord. He needs to follow the Lord. But that doesn't mean that other characteristics aren't important. You don't just throw everything else out the window and say, oh, they follow the Lord, sign me up.
Totally.
And pray through it. Not just, this would be a dream, but pray through, is it more than just going to church 3 times a month? Are they involved in church? And are they involved in an area that you love? Really sit down and don't just think about it, but invite the Lord into the conversation. Yeah. Lord, what do I need to be closer to you,
Totally.
It's a lifelong commitment, right?
Yeah, it's important. It's really the most important decision aside from, saying yes to Jesus. Right. That, a lot of Christians say that, but it's true to say, if you're going to step into something that, as Paul talks about, be careful. It's very important. It could distract you. It could derail you.
Totally.
There's marriage relationships, even between two people that are Christian people, but that they pull each other away from maybe the calling that God was leading them.
Right.
Maybe you do feel like you're supposed to start a business, but maybe your spouse really doesn't want you to do that. Or you're supposed to take a job that moves across the country, but your spouse doesn't want you to do that. Or you're supposed to stay at home, but you have this drive to go somewhere, and you pull your family apart because of a job or because of an opportunity. And so everyone has a different plan, and that's obviously for God and them to figure out. But I think there is an importance to say, when we step into this, we want to have a lot of the same alignments, or at least heading in the same direction. Yeah. Now, if God, drops something in your life that you weren't expecting, God knows what he's doing. He knows that you're together. But I think that's where, people say, I'm finding the one. I don't believe, and I don't think Scripture gives us any indication that there is one person out there for us. There's so many people on this planet. I think there are many people that you could have a God-honoring, successful, great legacy with.
Right.
But God says, choose one.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I don't believe if somebody maybe is getting out of a relationship recently, or maybe they've struggled to find that, the one that got away, there's this. I believe there's many people out there that could be great partners for people, but it's, I got to be that right person. I got to be committed to this. And I think that's what's really important is to, the lifelong commitment that, I'm in this forever. Right. And that's where I think you get a lot of people, especially in today's culture, even Christians who kind of feel like, because divorce is so common and, it's the stats is like over 50%. And I mean, many people listening to this will have parents who are divorced or, family members for sure. And it's just so commonplace now. I think it's like, it's like God doesn't like it, but it's something that just, if it happens, it happens. Right. And, it's something that I think we've diluted because of our culture. Yeah. And it doesn't mean we don't want to be sensitive to it, because it's one of the most hurtful things for people to go through. I've had people very close to me that have gone through it, and I want to be with them. Right. And God doesn't say, if you get divorced, you're going to hell. Right. But what he does say is, he says, I hate divorce. He doesn't say he hates people who get divorced, but he says, I hate it. Right. Because I hate what it does. I hate the thing that you're trying to show the world about who I am in your life and the covenant relationship that I have with you. When it breaks apart, God, I don't break that promise. Yeah. I don't break things apart. And so, I know as humans we fail, but God leans towards always mercy, forgiveness, grace. He says, this is the God that I am. So when we show the world that that's not the way we're living, then how could we show people about a God who has this covenant with us? But you broke that covenant. Right. People who are non-Christians say it all the time. Well, the divorce rate in the Christian community is just as high. Yeah. We're not setting a great example for that. Totally. And we don't want to dilute what God has given us, this gift. Again, we don't want to condemn, but I do think we're in a time and culture where we are at a point where we need to be direct. We need to be clear to say we're not brushing things under the rug because they're, it feels bad to confront somebody. Right. Nobody likes to confront people and say the sexual sin that you're in is wrong. That's a tough conversation. As a pastor, I have a lot of those conversations. Yeah. I've gotten better at them because it's just I just do it a lot. But it's hard to confront somebody and say, hey, how are you spending your money? Oh, no one wants to talk about that. Yeah. Hey, how are you treating the people in your life? Right. How is your relationship going? Man, those are tough questions to ask, but I think the responsibility of leaders, especially in the church, is to say, we're going to ask those tough questions, and we're going to take a strong stance on things because God values them.
Yeah. Right. I think I heard this the other day from a pastor. The softer you label the poison, the more dangerous it becomes.
Wow, that's good.
Right? So let's say you took a bottle of poison and put Hershey's chocolate syrup on it and put it in your fridge. Yeah. That's really dangerous for the next person who comes to the fridge. And so in our lives, whether it's divorce, whether it's sexual purity, I don't want to dilute anything. Right. Why? Because it's dangerous for me. It's going to hurt me. It's going to hurt my relationships. It's going to hurt my future. And it might feel comfortable in a moment, but long term, it's like,
Not worth it.
Wow, what a risk to say, oh, it's okay. You know, God doesn't mind divorce. No, the Bible's clear. God hates divorce. And again, God does not hate, I love what you said. God doesn't hate people who get divorced. God doesn't hate people. That's not the God we serve. God adores people. He'd give his life for you. But we ought to do everything in our power to say, I got to come into alignment with what the scripture says about a lifelong commitment. It's an important decision. Don't run into this. Have wisdom in your life. The counsel of many makes the man wise. Do these things, right? Set yourself, do the work on the front end. Prepare yourself in this season so the next season is great.
Totally. Yeah, and I'd say if you're listening to this and, you know, maybe you're in that season where you say, hey, I'm single, I'm trying to figure it out. I'd say encourage yourself in the Lord. I'd say enjoy it.
Yeah.
Travel.
Yeah.
Take a job that maybe you were that scares you a little bit. Do something that is something you maybe couldn't do if you were married. And if you're married, be married. Have a great time. Don't be insecure about it. Love your spouse. You know, enjoy it. Travel. Take a job. Like, do things that you can do when you're married.
Find friends that are couples.
Totally.
It's the best. It's so fun.
Absolutely. But I think the lack of contentment is something that steals our joy. Yeah. And to say, look at Jeremiah. He's got a whole book written about him, like 50-some chapters in the Bible. He stayed single. You look at priests and monks and all these people who stayed single. Some of them maybe, again, it's that weird reasoning, but it's don't look at your situation and say, if only I had that. Because if that's the way that you look at the world, you're going to say that when you're married. You're going to say that when you have kids. Yeah, if scary. Only my kids were great athletes like their kids. If only my kids were smart like their kids. If only I had a family like they had. Yeah. It's a cheap thought that's going to derail your future no matter what you get. And when we think, especially in singleness, I think that's a thing that we do, is that we focus on what they have. It's going to follow you for the rest of your life. So be aware, be cautious. And then in relationships, honor God. Let's be pure. Let's be bringing people closer. When we're in a relationship, that's a great barometer of how am I doing in my relationship? Yeah. Am I closer to Jesus than I was last year at this time? Am I closer to Jesus than I was before I met him or met her? That's a good indicator of I'm growing in this relationship. And you know, when it comes to finding the one, let's be very focused on the person that, you know, we're gonna potentially marry because you're in it forever. Right. But the last thing I'd say is don't put too much pressure on it. Yeah. And don't be this person that you're complaining about being single, but then there's all these people who've come into your life and it's no. Maybe you need to go back to step one, which is let's become the person that God's called me to be first. Yeah. And then I believe that I'm gonna see that. So wherever you're at in this, wherever you're listening from, maybe you're watching YouTube, Spotify, Apple podcast, we love you and we're glad. And you know, maybe you just found this video. We have other videos from our relationship series. We have Culture Convos coming up March 5th. But we just hope that this is fruitful for you. We hope that it encouraged you. And we'll be back with more podcasts coming soon. But in the meantime, have an awesome week serving Jesus. We'll see you back next time.